1980, I decided to investigate the historical evidence for Jesus. After 21 months of research, I came to the conclusion that Jesus is the unique Son of God, and that Christianity is true. Nearly 20 years later, I began another investigation that really put my faith to the test. After I became a Christian in 1981, I realized pretty quickly that even though this was the most important decision I'd ever made, it was only the first step in a long spiritual journey. I mean, I was excited about my new faith, and I had this picture of it just growing progressively stronger and stronger. But I discovered that the Christian life isn't always a smooth road. In fact, at times it can be more like a minefield, loaded with many of the same objections and doubts that I had when I was a skeptic. And these doubts are inevitable. I mean, to some degree, we're all going to have them. The question is, how will they affect us when they hit? Are we drawn closer to God through the experience, or are we pushed away by uncertainty and confusion? Many years ago, I came across the story of a prominent Christian leader whose confrontation with doubt dramatically changed his life. His name was Charles Templeton.
On March 18, 1946, Charles Templeton, a pastor from Toronto, Canada, and his close friend, William Franklin Billy Graham, boarded a plane for London, England, and a historic series of Christian meetings. Decades later, Templeton reflected on their friendship and ministry together.
Billy and I met in the spring of 1945 and was backstage at a Youth for Christ rally in Chicago. The stadium was packed, and as Billy was being introduced to preach, he leaned over to me and he said, "Pray for me, Chuck, I'm scared to death." Well, that started a friendship that has lasted for over 50 years.
Templeton and Graham were soon preaching at Youth for Christ rallies throughout North America. Both shared a passion for the same message, personal salvation through Jesus Christ.
In the 1940s, Youth for Christ was a North American phenomenon. The atmosphere was informal and upbeat, and thousands of young people flocked to the meetings. The movement soon attracted worldwide attention, so a team was selected to take our message to Europe.
For 5 weeks, Templeton and Graham traveled throughout the United Kingdom, France, and Scandinavia. They shared the pulpit, preaching on alternate nights to large, enthusiastic crowds. When they returned home, many believed that Templeton would go on to become the most successful evangelist of his generation. Yet, despite the effectiveness of his ministry, he found himself facing what he described as a growing dilemma.
In the months following our return from Europe, I began to fight a losing battle with my faith. I'd been so busy that there was little time to take stock of my life, but in those occasional quiet moments, the doubt started to surface. You see, I had converted to Christianity as a teenager, and I lacked the theological training necessary to support my beliefs when those inevitable questions hit me. I wanted very much to believe. I had an intense longing for relationship with God. But slowly, against my will, my mind and reason began to challenge and sometimes refute the things which were most important to me, the central beliefs of the Christian faith.
Templeton's doubts attacked the core of his deepest convictions, gradually eroding his belief in the validity of the Bible, the deity of Jesus, and the existence of a loving God.
My faith was disintegrating. I didn't have the theological training to deal with the questions that were troubling me. So, in a desperate attempt to find the answers, I decided to return to school.
In the fall of 1948, Templeton enrolled at Princeton Theological Seminary. After 3 years of study, he accepted a position with the National Council of Churches.
In the next few years, I moved across the United States and Canada, conducting 15-day preaching missions. Everywhere we went, we set record attendance. My days were filled with excitement, but I dreaded the nights. For at night, that was the time when the fears would set in. I would oftentimes break out into sweats, and my heart was pounding. I thought it was going to shake the bed. I had to ask myself, what right do I have to stand before thousands of people and try to convince them of something that I no longer believe? It was a reprehensible thing to do. So I had to stop. I had no possessions except a car and $600 in cash. And I would be cutting myself off from all of the wonderful friends that I had made in those years in the ministry. I felt like I was betraying all of them. But in the end, there was no real choice. So I packed everything that I owned into a rented trailer, and I started back on the road to Toronto.
Templeton remained in Canada for the rest of his life, working as a writer and news commentator. In 1996, he published his final book, Farewell to God, My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith.
What happened to Charles Templeton? Why did he abandon the faith that had once been the cornerstone of his life? I was fascinated by his story, so in 1999 I called him at his home in Toronto. I remember that he answered the phone with his very rich, deliberate voice. I told him that I was a writer and I wanted to interview him about the reasons he had for rejecting God. And he said, well, I'm not doing very well physically, but yes, if you'd like to come up to Canada, I'd be glad to talk with you. So I was on my way the very next morning. When I met him at his apartment, he looked weak and frail. At first, I didn't think he'd have the strength to talk for more than a few minutes, but he insisted that I stay. He was very cordial, very kind, and I liked him immediately. I could sense that his mind was sharp, and he really wanted to tell me his story. He reminisced for a while about his years in the ministry and his friendship with Billy Graham. It was obvious to me that their relationship was still very important to him. And then, after a few minutes, he turned the conversation to his reasons for rejecting Christianity. He described several common objections, and he had a long list, but a couple of things really stood out. He looked me right in the eye and asked two rhetorical questions. In a world with thousands of religions and gods, why is Jesus the only way to salvation? Are we actually supposed to believe that only the Christians have it right? And then, with even more intensity, he asked, how could a loving God, the God of the Bible, create a world filled with evil and suffering? He wasn't looking for a response. He just wanted me to understand these issues that had troubled him for almost 50 years. We talked for another hour, and then I said goodbye. As I drove back to Chicago, I thought about his story all the way home. He was on his way to becoming one of the greatest evangelists of the 20th century, but his faith was destroyed by doubts that I'd struggled with myself. I wish I could have given him some satisfying answers. I really wanted to help him. And I also wanted to know that my own faith could stand up to the tough questions that had ruined his. You know, I think that's the moment I decided to launch another investigation. During the next next 6 months, I traveled thousands of miles to interview scholars and theologians and ministry leaders who had confronted two of Templeton's major objections to Christianity. Why is Jesus the only way to God? And how can a loving God allow evil and suffering? When I left for my first interview, I remember feeling a little bit apprehensive. These were questions almost everyone faces at some point in life. And the answers aren't only difficult and controversial, they're also crucial to our perception of God.
Are we to believe only Christians are right? After all, Christians have the audacity to say that there is only one God, theirs, and that the gods of every other people on earth are spurious. The Apostle Paul stated bluntly, "There is no other name under heaven given among men by which you may be saved, for there is salvation in no other." Such an insufferable presumption.
Charles Templeton wasn't the only one who felt that Christians were narrow-minded and wrong to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. When I was an atheist, I'd often get angry about what seemed to me to be blatant arrogance. Who do Christians think they are? Why can they judge everyone else? Well, today my perspective has changed, but this idea of there being only one way to God is still one of the biggest obstacles to Christianity.
More than 2 billion people, about 1/3 of the world's total population, identify themselves as followers of Jesus Christ. At the center of their faith is the controversial and remarkable claim Jesus made the week before his crucifixion. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me."
I am the way, the truth, and the life. What was he saying? He really was saying there's only one way to the Father. No man comes to the Father but through me. Now, he doesn't say this in a vacuum. It isn't like this is something he just dreamt up there at the Last Supper. This is something that he's been saying in many different ways all the way through his ministry.
But the truth of the matter is that before Jesus came along, no one was claiming to be the exclusive manifestation of God on earth. This was not only a shocking claim, it was a scandalous claim, and early Jews were not expecting it. You know, it's not a surprise to me that Jesus got himself crucified. What's a surprise to me is that he lasted for 3 years in public ministry before that happened, making the kind of claims that he was making.
It's certainly a difficult thing to bring up in polite society that Jesus might be the only way to God. It can bring up rancor, and it can bring up bad feelings. But at the end of the day, the question is that true?
Today, Jesus' claim to be the exclusive path to God is often challenged by the assumption that all religions teach basically the same thing. And as a result, there are actually many ways to salvation.
The world religions do agree about some of their surface teachings, but when you get to the core of those religions, they are radically contradictory. Buddha was an agnostic about whether there was a God. In fact, a major strain of Buddhism does not believe that anything exists, much less God. Hinduism says that there are 330 million gods. Islam says that there's one God, and the greatest evil that can be conducted is to believe that God is a Trinity and Jesus was the Son of God. For Christians, that is the most important claim. Now, they can't all be right. They could all be wrong, but they can't all be right because they contradict one another.
I mean, think about it. Christians say that Jesus is the Messiah. Jews say that he's not. Either Jesus was the Messiah or he wasn't the Messiah, and if he wasn't the Messiah, the Jews are right and the Christians are wrong, and if he was the Messiah, the Christians are right and the Jews are wrong, but under no circumstance can they both be right. As one person put it, all religions are basically the same, except for the area of God and salvation and the problem of man and the afterlife and that kind of stuff. It turns out on the big issues, they're very, very different. They can't all be true.
While the theological differences between the world's major religions are glaring, individual believers, be they Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, or Jew, share a universal need. They have each experienced what the philosopher Pascal called a God-shaped vacuum in the heart, which cannot be filled by any created thing.
In dealing with religious studies at the graduate level, one thing we were pretty certain of, scholars across the board, that maybe human beings ought not to be called Homo sapiens, the wise man, but rather Homo religiosus, right, the religious man. Well, why is that? Because no matter where you go, there is this religious upwelling. Human beings have a sense, deep down and across the board, that they are in some way not right with the universe. What they're really sensing is they're not right with God. They sense their guilt, alienation, separation from God.
We hunger for a purpose and a meaning in life that goes beyond us. We need empowerment to live the kind of life we know we should, but we can't on our own. Jesus' identification of these problems and his solution to them is more profound than any other religion.
This is why Christianity makes so much sense, because it offers a solution to the genuine problem. And it doesn't sugarcoat it, it doesn't candy coat it, it doesn't look past the real problem. It identifies it for what it is.
It is written, "There is no one righteous, not even one. All have turned away. They have together become worthless, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God."
Throughout my research, I was struck by how clearly the Bible identifies humanity's most fundamental spiritual need. We're all separated from God by our sin, because he's perfect and pure and holy, and we're not. None of us has lived up to our own standard of morality, much less to God's, which is infinitely higher. And because the justice of God is also perfect, this separation should have lasted for eternity. But there's hope. God didn't just leave it at that, though he might have. Out of love, he reached down with a rescue effort. And the rescue effort wasn't just to toss some teaching our way and hope that we would live better lives. But the effort entailed, and this is where Christianity is absolutely unique, the effort entailed God becoming a man himself to communicate in the most clear form possible his intentions and desires, and to make a sacrificial provision for pardon for man's crimes against God.
Jesus is the one mediator between God and human beings that can be man standing in the presence of God and can be God standing in the presence of human beings. He's the only God-man. He's the only God-man who can fulfill that role of bringing rapprochement, reconciliation, healing to the broken and severed relationship between God and human beings.
What Jesus did then was to take the penalty for the crimes of men upon himself so that human beings could be freed. He took the rap for their crimes against God. Not only does God come down to reach out to man, but he gives him a free pardon of his crimes. The solution to the problem is not in making man better. Okay, let's make up for past deeds gone bad. Now that isn't going to work. The solution is grace.
You were dead in your trespasses and sins, but God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, And this, not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast.
Among the world's religions, the Christian doctrine of grace is absolutely unique. You see, grace means that there's nothing we can do ourselves that qualifies us for salvation. Outstanding moral behavior or a lifetime of good works, they're not going to get the job done. That's because God's forgiveness is a gift that we can never deserve and we can never earn.
The grace of God is a way of referring to the fact that when God loves us, when God does good things to us, when God sends Jesus Christ into the world, when God gives us his Spirit, this isn't as a reward for something that we have earned. It isn't because we have twisted God's arm. It is simply because God loves us, and he loves us lavishly, and he wants to make that lavish love a present reality in our lives.
God is not looking down at the world at different religious clubs, the Muslim club, the Christian club, the Jewish club, the Hindu club, and he's not saying, I like the Christian club better. To hell with the rest of you, quite literally. No, he's looking down at humanity, who is desperately wicked compared to his standards, who desperately needs to be rescued. And he offers a pardon, and he gives people an opportunity to either accept it or reject it. And this is why Jesus is the only way. Because he's the only one who solved the problem.
Suppose God knew that there was only one necessary and sufficient means to take care of the human dilemma. That would be sending his only begotten Son. Well, if there's only one sufficient means, please don't send me the pretenders. And if there's only one necessary means, we don't need any other ones. Why would God want to send 1,500 avatars or savior figures, none of which can completely do the job? What's the point of that when he can send his Son and it's accomplished in one person at one time through one set of events once for all? And that's the essence of why Jesus is the only way. He's the only sufficient and necessary means by which we may be saved.
The uniqueness of Jesus is magnified when his specific claims and teachings are compared with those of history's other religious leaders.
There is no other great religious leader who ever claimed to be the direct way to God in the way Jesus claimed it. The Buddha certainly didn't. Most Hindu gurus and leaders don't do that kind of thing. Muhammad certainly didn't do that. He would have thought that to be blasphemy. You could take Buddha out of Buddhism and you still have the teachings of the Buddha. Or you could take the Prophet out of Islam